Welcome to Rebuilding Our Past, Building New Futures, Examining Monuments and More in Rhode Island. My name is Julia Renaud, and I'm the Exhibition Manager and Curator at the Center for Reconciliation in Providence, and I'll be serving as the moderator for the program tonight. And I'm so happy that you're all here with us. Thank you so much for joining us. So we'll begin with a statement that's adapted from the writing of Olivia McNeil, who's the Assistant Director of the Brown Center for Students of Color at Brown University, and we thank her for these guiding words. We would like to acknowledge the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples on whose traditional lands the state of Rhode Island currently exists. We recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this territory, and we recognize and respect the enduring relationship that continues to exist between Indigenous people and the land. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on this territory from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought each of us to reside on this territory and to seek to understand our place within that history. Beyond this acknowledgement, we also encourage everyone present today to reflect on the current communities of the Indigenous peoples of whatever land that you live on, and think on how to live and work in allyship with these peoples. We would also like to note that the existence and legacy of the state of Rhode Island, as well as the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island, where the Center for Reconciliation now resides, would not be possible without the labor of enslaved and indentured Black people. We acknowledge, respect, and honor those whose forced labor allows us to work, live, and enter in community in this space. So I wanted to start also by telling you a bit about the Center for Reconciliation. We were founded in 2015 by the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island, and we're in the process of becoming a ministry of the diocese, which is very important, or which is very exciting for us. Our mission is to foster racial reconciliation and racial justice by confronting the legacy of slavery. And on behalf of myself, our Executive Director, Deborah Sharp, whom you'll hear from a little bit later on, our Board of Directors, the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island, and everyone involved with the CFR, we're so glad that you've joined us tonight for this very important conversation. So I want to give you a bit of an overview of how this event will go. So I'm going to start by kind of framing the subject and the issues that we'll be talking about. And then we'll have our four speakers share their thoughts with us, which I'm very excited about. So we will have, let me show you, Stephen Craddock, who is a third-term councilman for the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head, Aquinnah, followed by Dr. Christopher Roberts, who's the Social Equity and Inclusion Research Fellow at Rhode Island School of Design, or RISD, followed by Stephanie Fortunato, who's the Director of the City of Providence's Department of Arts, Culture, and Tourism, and then finally, Becci Davis, who is a Rhode Island-based interdisciplinary artist. Following our speakers' remarks, we'll have a brief discussion on two questions that I circulated to the speakers prior to the event. And then we'll have 20 to 25 minutes of for opportunity for everyone here with us tonight to ask questions and share your comments with the panelists. So you can chat those questions directly to me and I will pass them on. We'll try to get through as many as we can. And just so you know, the chat is open now. Feel free to introduce yourself, say hello. Once the speakers start speaking, we will disable the chat just to minimize distraction. And then once we go to the Q&A portion, we'll enable it so that you can chat your questions directly to me. So without further ado, public commemoration in Rhode Island. So this discussion has been occurring for years, decades, centuries. However, right now, it's really been amplified given the heightened discourse we're having in this country around history, race, identity, and justice. Public commemoration is a lightning rod, and it's often used as a shorthand for the versions of history the dominant cultures wish to celebrate, and also a focal point for how those histories are understood and used in the context of our present discussions. Often monuments, which in this discussion means usually statues commemorating specific people, are the focus of the conversation about public commemoration. But in our conversation tonight, I invite you to expand your thinking about public commemoration beyond monuments to historic markers, memorials, and even more smaller and more daily instances like signs on homes and street names. Public commemoration is a mirror of and a daily reinforcement of the profound and centuries-old power dynamics in our society. Who is recognized and venerated, and who is invisible and oppressed? Whose stories are told in our public spaces, and whose histories are not? And how does that shape our world today? Can we commemorate histories of violence and oppression without celebrating them? And what might future commemoration look like in Rhode Island? In Rhode Island, as well as throughout our country, our public commemoration includes agents of enslavement, colonization, and genocide, many of whom are celebrated historic figures in mainstream white American culture. The question of how to engage with these forms of public commemoration has become quite urgent in many communities. Some argue that public commemoration is merely symbolic, but you can also acknowledge that symbols are very powerful and emotionally charged, and that it's also very important to think about when instances of public commemoration were created and why. They're not just documents, straightforward documents of the histories that they present, but rather reflections of the conversations, values, and politics of the times when they were created. So current discourse has most publicly centered on statues of Confederate leaders, but it really has rippled through the many elements of our country's complex and diverse history. And these commemorative works have been gathering places for this discourse to take place. We've also seen physical interventions by members of the public, and sometimes relocation or removal of statues, markers, and names by officials. The issue has attracted the attention of the current president, who has offered his own guidelines and weighs in frequently. So where does Rhode Island fit in all this? There are many of the same echoes of the national history and conversation, but there's also our own particular history and dynamics. As in terms of Indigenous history, as with many other Indigenous peoples throughout the rest of the country, Indigenous peoples in present-day New England suffered genocide and land dispossession with the advent of white settler colonialism. And they've also demonstrated great resilience and cultural continuity and continue to steward the land and their culture today. I will not attempt to summarize the complex politics and dynamics of the early colonial period in New England, but I will mention King Philip's War between 1675 and 1678 between the United Colonies of New England and the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and other Indigenous peoples. And during and after this war, which was won by British colonists, thousands of Indigenous people in Rhode Island and New England were killed, and many survivors fled the area or were captured and sold into slavery in English colonial households into the Caribbean. It's also important to note the interweaving of Indigenous and African-American communities in Rhode Island starting in the early colonial period, where we had enslaved and free people of African descent building families with enslaved and free Indigenous people. And we see the Indigenous tribes in Rhode Island surviving and thriving to this day. It'd also be remiss without mentioning Rhode Island's integral roles in Black chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. White Rhode Islanders conducted more than 60% of North Americans' trade in enslaved African people, and the state had the largest population of enslaved people of African descent in New England in the 18th century. White wealth in Rhode Island was built on the slave trade and slavery, and enslaved people lived and worked throughout the state, from Newport, Bristol, and Providence, those urban centers, to the plantations of South County. For the Center for Reconciliation, this history is close to home, and in fact, the reason for our founding by the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island. The Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island participated in and profited from slavery and the slave trade. And even with gradual emancipation in Rhode Island, the 19th century brought continued violence and legal and extra-legal discrimination against Black people. And then we see this also going into the 20th century, as well as creative survival and continual evolution of Black communities in Rhode Island. So monuments and public commemoration in Rhode Island reflect this complicated and violent history. Most recently, we've seen discussions around statues of Christopher Columbus in Westerly, Newport, and Providence. We've also seen conversations around school names like Isaac Hopkins Middle School in Providence, and street names. Stages of Freedom has done great work around renaming. They had Meiji Street renamed, and now they're working on Obadiah Brown Street renaming, but that's a continual effort. And there's also, going along with that, there's been a robust effort over the last few decades to rename streets, erect new monuments, memorials, and markers, and interpret the built environment as it exists to shed light on all of these histories and to shed light on the many contributions of Rhode Islanders of color. We've seen all of these conversations around interventions and relocations and removals happening here in Rhode Island, and it's been taken up by city and state governments to different degrees. And so, to be clear, this discussion isn't a referendum on any particular monument or situation, but rather one instance of an ongoing discussion about what public commemoration of these figures and these histories means here in our state, and what new futures for public commemoration might look like. And we recognize that there are many voices that can and should contribute to this conversation, and we're really looking forward to hearing from our speakers and to hearing from you and to all the conversations that will hopefully come from this. So with that, I am happy to introduce our first speaker, Stephen Craddock. Just one moment while I share my screen. Here we are. So Stephen is a citizen of the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe of Massachusetts. He was elected to tribal council as a third-term councilman. He serves as a tribal cultural resource monitor with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. He's also a liaison to the Tribal Department of Natural Resources, the chair of the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy Committee, and tribal representative for economic development with the United South and Eastern Tribes. Presently, Steve is also serving on the Plymouth 400 Board of Directors. He has over 20 years of experience in executive leadership in nonprofit and private sector management, including work in diversity and inclusion, community relations, organizational capacity building, and employee relations. He also has an extensive background in civic engagement, including serving in a leadership capacity on numerous boards of directors, and including educational and healthcare institutions. He's also involved in youth recreation and neighborhood political affairs. He earned his bachelor's degree from Tufts University in social psychology and urban affairs. A proud father of two, he is married and a resident of Cranston, Rhode Island. So welcome, Steve, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Or I should say, Wanikisak all. I'm pleased to be here, and I want to give thanks for the invitation to join this panel and this opportunity to have this dialogue, which is very, very important. As I was listening to your opening words, it's always emotional. You try to detach, and it's impossible. I am descendant of Aquinnah Wampanoags. I'm also the descendant of enslaved Africans who toiled on plantations, rice plantations, South Carolina. I'm also descendant roots of the Catawba Nation. And I'm a firm believer in generational trauma, but also believe in generational fortitude. So it's always emotional, and I want to speak from the heart and from my gut. I want to say up front that my words don't formally represent the Aquinnah Wampanoag Nation. However, the sentiments and the general viewpoints are widely shared with my brothers and sisters. We look at monuments and statues and commemorations and celebrations within Rhode Island or around New England. And consistently, I think you heard that refrain, we're all aware that the message basically is that if you're indigenous, you're invisible, or that you are a relic of the past, that you're somehow frozen in time, and that you're not a colleague or neighbor or a family member. And of course, that's not the case. Aquinnah Wampanoag, we've been on our homeland for over 10,000 years. We've never, ever left. And we have the roots of our land speaks to us. And if we listen, they give us guidance to the future. And as I was reflecting on today and some of the comments I wanted to share, I started thinking about the first encounter and how that story or that narrative typically starts at 1619 or 1620. And that's true. But there were other encounters going back to 1602 and before that. Years of trading and cross connections and interactions with foreigners and Europeans and traders of the sort. But also there was capture and there was kidnappings and enslavement of our people along the coast of Cape Cod, the Nauset, the Capewalks, Island Wampanoags. And in particular, I want to highlight Ipanau, 1611, who was captured off that very shore of our homeland of Nope and brought to England as a spectacle to be displayed and paraded around England at the time. With his own, I think, will and ability to assess the situation, he sized up where he was and he devised a plan to get back home. And he played on the greed and the desire to actually acquire more indigenous native folk for information, for enslavement, with the idea that there was gold in the cliffs of Aquina. And so that expedition sailed back to the shore of Nope. And when he greeted his brothers and his cousins in our own native tongue, arranged to meet the next day. And upon that next day, when the sun rose and the Mishuns came out to greet, there was a skirmish, and Ipanau jumped ship and swam ashore into the arms and bosom of his family of the Quina Wampanoag. And I'm sharing that story because from there, he assumed sachem and leadership and had an influence on the region. So for 20 years post the landing of the Plymouth colony, the message was to stay clear of Nope and the islands, quote unquote, that they were savages. There was this tension. Ipanau was also present with Osamequin when negotiations and discussions around collaboration and coexistence were worked out. And I'm pointing that out to say that there was two sides of that tension. There was collaboration and working together, but there was also wariness due to captivity and enslavement and Ipanau's own personal experiences firsthand, what was concocted and what were some of the missions. So when we look at the story of our founding of this nation as we know it today, there are a lot of blind spots, a lot of gaps that I believe intentionally designed to make the narrative cleaner and more palatable. I really, really think we're at the cusp of seizing an opportunity to correct that wrong and lean into the difficult conversations and really speak truth to power and really honestly to listen to the guidance of our ancestors that are talking and leading the pathway forward for us. I really believe the time is right now, and more so than other times, the voice of our ancestors are being heard. I'm having very, very frequent conversations with neighbors, with strangers around this very topic, excuse me. And in this, typically it's a one-off, but I'm having sustained, honest, heartfelt conversation, tears of remorse, but also laughter with exuberance of where we can go in the future. Within the tribe, and for those of you who have joined us who are indigenous or of color, you might recall a continuum of 7 generations. So you make a decision based on the 3 generations that came before you and how that informs and influences the present. And as you're gathering your thoughts, and in your heart and your soul and the data around you, you're thinking about that decision and how it will inform 3 generations ahead. So I encourage all of us, and I think the work is starting to be done, that we approach this work with the idea of 7 generations. The past does in fact matter, and the present corral the actions to make good work ahead. And if we think about what our actions today will have on the generations to come, we'll be in good stead. And so with that, I'm looking forward to today's conversation and discussion, and mostly learning and listening. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate that. And looking forward to the conversation as well. Next up, we have Dr. Christopher Roberts. So Christopher Roberts earned a PhD in Africology and African American Studies from Temple University and a master's degree in Ethnic Studies from San Francisco State University. He is currently Research Fellow of Social Equity and Inclusion at the Rhode Island School of Design. In his work, he examines Black geographies of memory and forgetting, with an emphasis on port cities in the US that anchored the transatlantic and domestic slave trades. Prior to teaching at RISD, he taught at Brown University, where he was the Artemis A.W. and Martha Jakowski Postdoctoral Fellow at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. Before that, he taught at Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey, and Temple University in Philadelphia. In addition to his career in academia, Roberts spent 10 years as a museum professional working in educational programming and tour design at the Betty Ono Gallery in Oakland, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture in Baltimore. And with that, I say, welcome, Christopher.
Oh yeah, thank you for all of that. I'm so glad to be here with everybody, to see some familiar faces, some new faces, and it's great. So I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have some prepared remarks, so I'm gonna get into those. So yeah. I would like to start with thanking the Creator for this opportunity, the Africana spiritual community for looking out for me, and my ancestors for walking with me. More specifically, I would like to call on Marshawn McCarroll, Lisa Clifton, and my Aunt Rosalind Graham, my high school football teammate Sean Gamble, and Carter G. Woodson to accompany me in this particular moment. I ask for precision, perspective, humility, and clarity as I begin this work of awakening while in the wake of the unrelenting as a practitioner of Africana studies. Ashe. All right, a special thank you to Julia, Deborah, everyone at CFR. Thank you to my colleagues speaking today. Also a special thank you to Tracy Picard for all the work that you've done through and beyond CFR. And I would be remiss if I didn't say a huge thank you to Elon Cookley for personally welcoming me to the work of CFR during your time here. And none of the work here is possible without the path you laid specifically and the baton you've left for those of us to continue and pick up this work that you're so committed to doing, as I hope we all are committed to as well. So about me, I spent the past 7 years thinking about this question of memorialization and memory very explicitly and directly as a scholar. However, I've been thinking about it as a person and a member of different communities for much longer than that. And entering my 3rd year of being in Rhode Island, I want to profusely be explicit about the fact that I do not position myself as any sort of definitive authority or expert on what people in the state should do. I'm actually not a huge fan of the word should in general. I'm still learning and growing and learning from and living with people who reside here and have been here and are from here, who know this place in their bones and their blood more intimately than I ever do or will. Being from Baltimore, Maryland, I know what it's like for outsiders to come in and declare to you that they have arrived at some final solution to something that you have lived with and experienced in ways they never could. And this idea that you simply were not sort of cunning enough or intelligent enough to figure that out. I'm not here to offer final answers. There's no dimming light or inquisitive monotone from any Regis Philbin character inquiring about my sureness. So this is not my final answer, so to speak. In fact, the answers are not with me as an individual anyway. The answers are, and always have been, with the people. especially Black people, especially Indigenous people, especially trans people, especially non-binary people, especially disabled people, especially undocumented people, especially Latinx people, especially working class people in South Providence, especially the people who clean your homes, especially the people who wash your clothes, especially the people who take care of your kids, especially those, as quote, essential workers who are daily being offered a sacrifice for the leisure of the elite and the wealthy and the otherwise comfortable during this current pandemic. So if you were to ask me for answers, I would simply suggest to you, listen to them. And their memories and their histories are a much more worthwhile starting point than the words of any one expert, including myself. Instead, I'm here today as a Black person who's interested in being in relation with people, especially Black people, but people writ large who are from this place and people who care about this place, while understanding that caring for this place may require undoing what we know of as this place, undoing what we have been told and what we are being told so that something else may emerge. And this is not the only place that may be in need of such an undoing. In fact, I would assert that it most certainly is not, but it is the place where we are, it is the place where I am, and it is the place to which ancestrally I'm being called and is calling me. Therefore, it is this place I will be discussing today. And I want to discuss some things that do not normally come up in these types of conversations, at least in my experience. Hence, I'll be focusing on truth, reconciliation, and history as primary themes through this idea of undoing. So about Rhode Island. Recently, the mayor announced a move for a, quote, truth-telling, reconciliation, and municipal reparations process. This has emerged in no small part due to the very important and necessary activism of Black and brown folks on the ground and committed folks otherwise on the ground here in the city. I would suggest, however, that this effort be one where community members themselves remain unrelenting in pushing this to be more than a show of, quote, growth from those in power that offers little substance. Because unfortunately, TRCs are utilized by the state and local governments not to repair or reckon, but to empathize and hear without actually changing what made the trauma that brought the need for the TRC in the first place. I'm thinking about and really thinking with, in this conversation, scholar Avina Asare, who calls for us to think about the, quote, long and winding road between historical consciousness and political change. So like what's the distance between knowing better and doing better, right? For Asare, she's specifically thinking about this in the context of Ghana, specifically their NRCs or their NR commissions in 2005. And she generously shares her lessons from this specific continental African context with the larger global Black diasporic community. Having the opportunity to meet and learn from Dr. Asare, I consider her one of the foremost thinkers about the implications of gestures such as, quote, truth and reconciliation. She says the TRC, and for everybody, TRC, when I say that, I mean Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She says the TRC has become all but obligatory in the effort to enshrine peace, democracy, and stability in the aftermath of conflict. She goes on to say Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are rooted in an ascendant international human rights framework, and the part displays the contradictions of the whole. TRCs capture the world's imagination by suggesting that the alignment of the political and moral order is possible. She cautions that far too often we have an abundance of truth-telling, but we do not always or often get to the reconciliation part. And for me, it's about, okay, well, can we align these two things? Can a sort of morals or ethics that we are interested in be aligned with the politics that govern and organize the world we're in? For Asare, this isn't a thinking or a way to not do TRCs as a whole. The TRC is not a failure in and of itself, but the strongest potential for it lies in what she describes as the cacophony of the masses speaking their truth, and the weight of the honesty of the people undoing the state reifying intentions of the TRC in normal circumstances. Normally, TRCs are government-directed public history projects. She describes them garbed in a vivid moralism that appears at first to be nation building as usual. So her thinking here is that oftentimes a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is done to say, hey, we did this bad thing, but see, we're actually doing better and we're moving and we're improving. And it ultimately ends with the people who needed to be called to the carpet ending up as not necessarily the heroes, but that they're the reason that this thing has gotten better. And we ultimately end with a narrative that says, yeah, this was bad, but ultimately the nation is still okay, the state is still okay, the city is still okay. But for me, is it? I want us to really think about that. So she says that when the voices of the people are what drive the action and what follows, there's a small window for a different potential. So in terms of TRCs, this is not a declaration of why not to do them, but rather an offering of a potential practice of ensuring that what drives the effort is the truth that is spoke and that comes from Black and Indigenous people themselves, no less. So it's not about making Rhode Island look better through the TRC, but speaking truth, no matter what the outcome is. An outcome that if we let that truth do its thing, will likely be an undoing of what we know of as Rhode Island. And I'm about to come to a close because I know we're coming up on time. I'd like to close with a word about Rhode Island and the specific way that the state, at least in my research and my time being here, and Providence in particular, approaches much of its past through the lens of what I would describe as one that isolates and petrifies the past more than opens it up and allows it to unfurl. By that, I mean there tends to be a storytelling in public that isolates people and moments in such a way that continues to reify, meaning like elevate, right, as better, not only the nation and the state, but the very specific individual actors and moments that I'm sure my colleagues will get into that ushered the nation and the state into existence. Rhode Island must interrogate its inclination to valorize that which, per its mayor and seemingly many well-meaning liberal whites, must be reconciled. How does a state that more than almost any other envisions itself as the genesis and arbiters of the events and ideas that ushered the American Revolution and the American project as a whole into existence? See Roger Williams, see Christopher Columbus, see the Gatsby Affair, and see on and on and on and on. How will Rhode Island reconcile the very thing upon which it claims its spawn is the very thing that needs to be reconciled, reckoned, or dare I say undone itself? How do you come to terms with what you say is your quote #1 hit, so to speak, right? Rhode Island must refuse what historian Michelle Roth-Trio describes as, in the case of Columbus, the isolation of a single moment that thus creates a historical fact. For example, that on this day in 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the Bahamas. As a set event, void of context and marked by a fixed date, this is Trio talking, not me, this chunk of history becomes more manageable. It returns inevitably. One can await its millennial and prepare its commemoration. We must engage, this is me, we must engage in historical reckoning that refuses to be manageable, that is not an inevitability, but instead is in an opening and perhaps even an undoing. Thank you, and I'll pass it over to my colleagues now.
Thank you so much, Christopher, and thank you for all of those openings and questions that you're posing. So next, we'll have Stephanie Fortunato with us. Stephanie Fortunato has been the director of Providence's Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism since 2016. She leads the department at the intersection of cultural planning and urban development, collaborating with local communities to create arts-based policies and partnerships that strengthen neighborhoods and transform public spaces. In this capacity, she will be a member, ex officio, of the City of Providence's proposed special committee to review commemorative works. Previously, Ms. Fortunato was Director of Programs for the Pawtucket Foundation and a consultant with Jane Clark Chermayeff Associates LLC. Ms. Fortunato began her career on Long Island, working for the Huntington Arts Council and as a curator of the local history museum. She's on the board of Waterfire, the Providence-Warwick Convention and Visitors Bureau, and on the advisory committees for the Providence Tourism Council, Congressman Jim Langevin's Arts and Culture Committee, and New England Foundation for the Arts. In 2018, Ms. Fortunato received the Mary Brennan Tourism Award from the Rhode Island Hospitality Association. She has served as a panelist for the National Endowment for the Arts and Rhode Island State Council for the Arts, among other agencies. She received her master's degree in public humanities from Brown University and a bachelor's degree from Providence College. Welcome, Stephanie.
Unmuting myself is always a step. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Julia, for putting together such a thoughtful panel and conversation. And to the other panelists, I'm so excited to hear your perspective on all of this today. I also want to give a special thank you to Emma Boast, who I see is here as a participant, who really has done the bulk of the research that goes into the work that I'm going to talk about today, that is the city's review of commemorative works and how we are approaching that. I said this to the panelists earlier, but I want to say this to the larger group. I'm actually kind of surprised that commemorative works have become the subject of such a wide public dialogue. And I am here definitely as the bureaucrat on this, so I'm going to talk about how the city is responding to this conversation. But I did start, and I am still a human being, who started the work at the city, really surprised that there was no official policy from the city of Providence about how to deal with commemorative works that we find in public spaces throughout our neighborhoods. I was, I guess, aware that power and privilege was always at the heart of these decisions, but I think that I didn't realize how discretionary the decisions had been over time. It had as much to do about which departments were approached for that permission as how well funded or organized the champions were. So in many instances, the collection of monuments, markers, and memorials that we have in the city of Providence represents a very narrow focus. And in very few instances was there a broad public debate about whether or not the city should accept these objects, which were often posed as donations. And over time, their champions may or may not be an active part of our community. So even if they, in the beginning, had endowments and plans for care, over time, the city became the stewards of these works. And so also the conversation about how to care for these objects was often not really well addressed. And so we saw both the deterioration of some objects in public realm, as well as what I would call the just invisibility of these objects. In 2017, the city began working to develop a policy through our public art master planning process. And at the time, it made sense to me to categorize these objects as public sculptures, because that's how the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism was often being invited to the conversation. But I'm very grateful that our public art consultants, once they got into this topic, suggested the need for a dedicated process, which has led to this transparent public commemoration committee. And so I'm going to share my screen and tell you a little bit about how we're planning to operationalize this city policy. First, I have to find my screen sharing abilities, which we practiced earlier. Julia, where am I looking? I'm sorry, everyone. I'm having a day of Zoom challenges. Is it at the top?
At the bottom, probably. The little green.
Oh, there it is. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Oops. And of course, it's at the wrong spot. Just to make sure that everyone got to see how we fumble through that. But some of you may know that we at the city level, in order to begin anything in true consideration, we must define what we're talking about. And so as we began the process of thinking about a commemorative works policy, it became important to actually let people know how we were defining this. And so we are thinking about objects at this point, not about the names of buildings or parks or those things. So at the moment, we are looking at monuments, markers, memorials, and other similar permanent installations that are really meant to reflect a collective history, to honor an individual, a moment in time, a group, or a place that should have significance to our local community. The proposed, or I'm sorry, this is actually not proposed any longer. The Special Committee for the Review of Commemorative Works was created by ordinance, and that ordinance was passed in June. And one of the remarkable things about this ordinance in this moment is that it was jointly sponsored by 5 city council members, and it's a resolution that was passed also with the mayor's office. So it was both the executive and legislative branch that made this ordinance possible. The committee will have 2 ex officio roles, myself in the role of Director of Art, Culture, Tourism, and the City Archivist for our successors. And then there are 5 members that will be voting that are appointed from the City Council, from the Mayor's Office, our Art and City Life Commission, that's our Public Art Commission. The Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism and City Archives will also have the opportunity to appoint members to this committee. And we imagine, and the folks who have been nominated already, are scholars in the fields of history, commemoration, or artists who are practicing in this area. The special committee, the thing that we're asking them to do is to determine whether there is social and cultural merit for a commemorative work. And they've created, we have a rubric that they'll be measuring this standard against. And again, Emma Boast, thank you for figuring out some of this. But the particular considerations have to do with local and community relevance, have to do with, does it make sense for Providence? You know, looking at the public life and public space, so the site specificity of it, looking at how it does reflect our Providence community, past and present, thinking through some of the nuanced complexity that these monuments can represent. And thinking then also about the design, thinking about can we, and this is a practical consideration for the city, how well can we care for this object over time? We will be opening up applications, asking people to submit either a request for review. So this is an existing commemoration in the collection. People can request a review of that commemoration, or to propose the donation of a new commemorative works. And again, it'll be measured against those five markers. The applications, we hope, will be reviewed twice a year. So we've just opened the application and hope that the first public hearing will happen this fall. That will be the first time that the special committee will have a chance to engage with the public about these commemorations. The city archivist will be preparing briefings so that we will have an understanding of how they came to be in the public realm in the first place, as well as putting together some considerations of the contemporary community, because many of these are historic objects that have been in the public realm for a long time. Although when you get into it, some of them have been moved around the city as well, but that's a whole other story we'll get into. The public hearings are really meant to be robust conversations about these objects. And it's really meant to be a forum in which we can, I think Christopher, you said that so well, but really reckon with these historical objects and what they are what they do symbolize. They are meant to really inform the special committee members as they make a recommendation about what to do about these commemorative works. And they're meant to then give the bodies so the recommendations will be received by the governance of each of the sites. So if it is in a park, the Board of Parks Commissioners will receive that recommendation, but it's meant for them to feel confidence in the recommendations that they will adopt it. I think there's a couple of different outcomes for these objects once they've been reviewed. I mean, it could be that there is no action that is taken. It could be that the objects are modified in some way, that they're relocated, that they're deaccessioned, that they're reinterpreted, probably also should be on that, on that list as well. So we have 3 members who have been confirmed for the committee. Becci Davis, who is a fellow panelist here today. We are thrilled to have this artist on the committee for the Art and City Life Commission. April Brown, the director of the Langston Hughes Community Poetry Reading. This is a city council nomination. Marco McWilliams, the public historian who's at Brown, studying Africana Studies. So they have been appointed already, and there are 2 appointments that will still be made. There's also an advisory board that my office has put together to help us make decisions. So we are creating this process and we want it to be as sound as possible. And so this is the leaders of many of the humanities organizations. Elizabeth Francis, who's joining us here today, is the chair of this committee. But it's really to help us make good decisions through the process, to help us review those applications when they come in and decide which are ready to go to public hearing. Not all of them will be, probably when we receive them. And we'll work with those applicants, but we want to make sure that we are testing them with this body, with this advisory committee. If you're interested in seeing the ordinance, you can find it on the city's website, and I can share those links later on in the chat bar if you're interested in the intricacies of how this becomes law. And the application and FAQ on the commemorative works is on the department's blog site, which is artculturetourism.com. You can find the particulars about the rubric that will be used for social and cultural merit. But it's a really interesting experience to take some of this theory and to put it into a process and to create policy around this. I'm really excited, though, by the opportunity that the ordinance presents for this to be part of the work of city government in perpetuity. And so I hope that everyone here will participate in that process and will make sure that we are really addressing these commemorative works for what they are, and that we're able to revisit that over time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That's very exciting to hear the updates on what the committee is doing. So thank you. And next we will have Becci Davis, whom Stephanie mentioned, and I am proud to introduce. Becci Davis was born on a military installation in Georgia named after General Henry L. Benning of the Confederate States Army. Her birth initiated her family's first generation after the Civil Rights Act and its fifth generation post-emancipation. Becci is a Rhode Island-based interdisciplinary artist who finds inspiration in exploring natural and cultural landscapes, as well as in her experiences as a daughter, mother, American, and Southern born and raised Black woman. After earning her MFA from Lesley University College of Art and Design in 2017, Becci was the recipient of the St. Botolph Club Foundation Emerging Artist Award in Visual Art, the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts Fellowship in New Genres, the Providence Public Library Creative Fellowship, and the RISD Museum Artist Fellowship. She was also featured as one of Art New England Magazine's 10 Emerging Artists of 2019. Working across disciplines, Becci collects still and moving images, documents, sound, and oral narratives. Using this collection of evidence combined with her own interpretation and response, she constructs what Pierre Nora would call realms of memory, devices for remembering people, places, and events. Using these devices, along with physically occupying space with her body, Becci creates a new history and personal geography. Welcome, Becci.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Julia. Thank you also for facilitating and moderating this talk. I would like to thank my ancestors for putting my feet on the path that they walk today and for continuing to guide me. I'd also like to thank the Center for Reconciliation for hosting this event. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for being here. And I'd also like to thank you for witnessing. I appreciate your time and attention. I need to start screen sharing. Just one moment. Okay. All right. This up here. Okay. So let's see. Okay. So I would like to start by posing a question. Take a moment to visualize an antebellum homestead in the South. When you use your mind's eye to create this picture of the past, where do the various elements that make up that picture come from? To some extent, traces that remain may help you picture the past. Maybe you've seen artifacts in a museum, you're a fan of Mark Twain, or you've read books that were written around the same time period. Perhaps snippets of music like Old Folks at Home come to mind. Various interpretations may also play a large role. Think of how much your mind's image may have been gleaned from books or period films like Gone with the Wind or Cold Mountain. You may ask yourself why history books are listed under interpretation. It's important to remember that textbooks are not neutral. Earlier this year, the New York Times published an analysis of text works from 2 different states that depicted vastly different narratives of the same events. The point I'm trying to make here is that the ways we typically think about the past, whether from traces or interpretation, often perpetuate biased and narrow representations of that past. The history that was written is from a singular point of view, that of an oppressive and exploitative culture. We cannot change the past, but we can practice honesty and empathy when we talk about past events. My art practice considers the way we as a culture think about and represent history in general. But for the purposes of today's conversation, I would like to explain the context for my position on monuments and their function, while also briefly discussing several local monuments and the men they honor. I would also like to point out that, like Dr. Roberts, I'm not here to offer concrete solutions. What I do offer is a list of questions and ways to move forward. And more on that soon. Okay. Something I hear a lot are that monuments are, quote, history, that they are actual relics of the past, and to remove them would be an attempt to erase history. My response is always the same: questioning the appropriateness of monuments in public space and removing them if we find that they no longer serve our values, or no longer represent our values or serve their purpose, has been a part of our identity as Americans since before our country actually became a nation. This is a detail of a historical painting by Johannes Adam Simon Ortel. It depicts the first equestrian monument in America, King George III heroically astride a horse. The structure was located in Bowling Green, New York. On the eve of the Revolutionary War, a group of patriots gathered around this monument and worked collectively to pull it down. These soon-to-be American citizens understood the implicit power dynamics of monument building. They knew that the structure was erected as a reminder of who was in charge. During a time when tensions were already running high about the future of the colonies. These colonists were also without a sense of irony, since they used the metal from the monument to create munitions for the imminent war. I would like to introduce you to another equestrian monument. This one presides over Kennedy Plaza, a park and major transportation hub in Providence, Rhode Island. This monument honors Union General Ambrose Burnside. He played a major role in the Battle of the Crater and had a terrible reputation as a military commander. Although Burnside enjoyed a successful political career after the Civil War, it was decided to depict him in uniform and posing in a typical heroic military stance astride a horse. There's a lot to unpack here regarding depictions of masculinity in the cultural landscape, but that's a conversation for another day. Many of you know the story of this monument to Christopher Columbus that until recently stood in the Elmwood community. This monument was designed by Frederick Bartholdi and constructed by the Gore Manufacturing Company that was located in the same neighborhood. Although for years there were members of the community who called for its removal, those efforts were delayed by concerns of the monument's artistic and historic significance to the neighborhood's industrial past. It's doubtful that we need to discuss the controversy surrounding honoring Columbus. But I would like to leave you with this excerpt from the statue's dedication in 1893 by Professor Alonzo Williams. Moreover, the ethnic character of a people was never more suitably adapted to its physical environment and to its political mission than that of the dominant race in the New World. That grand struggle for supremacy in the beginning was the first crucial test in our history. Then and there was decided the fate of this republic. After reading this quote, the connection between white supremacist delusion and this particular monument seemed obvious to me. This is Isaac Hopkins. His monument stands in the heart of a square named after his family at the intersection of Charles and Branch Streets. He served as the sole naval commander during the Revolutionary War. He was also involved in politics, and his brother, Stephen Hopkins, was a governor and enslaver. His house still stands on College Hill. It's currently a museum. Isaac was also the captain of the Sally. The Sally was a ship funded by the Brown brothers for a triangular trade voyage to capture enslaved people from the African coast with the intent to sell them for profit. Isaac's lack of experience and very poor judgment resulted in the death of 109 of the 196 enslaved people held on his ship. The surviving 87 people were subjected to serious illness and unspeakable suffering. This is Nathaniel Greene, and the monument honoring him stands in front of our State House. Greene served as a general during the Revolutionary War and held command mostly in the Southern Theater. After the war, Southern states gifted him with plantations to express their gratitude. Greene maintained these plantations and held hundreds of enslaved people. So how do we begin to engage with these existing monuments? I believe that while they remain in place, we cannot start to reconcile with the past atrocities that they directly or indirectly celebrate. But I would like to discuss one previous project. So this space surrounding the General Burnside Monument, earlier mentioned, was a location for a recent series of site-specific interventions I facilitated. The goal of this particular project was to start a conversation about the achievements of 6 Rhode Island women who were contemporaries of the general and largely without public commemoration sites of their own. It also sought to democratize the practice of monument building by literally using the general's platform to remember people appointed by visitors that came to the park that day. This project was sponsored by the Downtown Providence Parks Conservancy, the RISD Museum, and the Rhode Island State Council for the Arts. The 6 women honored by this project were Eleanor Eldridge, a woman of Black and Narragansett ancestry who was an entrepreneur and successfully sued to have her land reinstated after it was seized by a neighbor. Ida Lewis was a lighthouse keeper and expert swimmer. She became famous for her skills at saving lives. Katie Brownell was a Civil War veteran and one of the only women legally granted permission to enlist as a soldier. She actually served under Burnside's command for a time. Sarah Harris Fairweather, an abolitionist, an Underground Railroad station master, and the first Black woman in the nation to integrate a school. Dr. Harriet Rice was the first Black woman to graduate from Wellesley College, a member of the 2nd generation of academically trained women doctors in the country, and a World War I medical hero. And Charlotte Daly, who was commissioned by the governor to visit and cheer wounded and ill Rhode Island soldiers during the Civil War. She also was tasked with collecting data on their conditions and locations, and that information was published. An original copy of that publication is part of the Providence Public Library's special collections. So, in closing, I would like to offer that monuments are not merely public art. They have a purpose, and that purpose is to demonstrate power and to communicate the values and collective memory of the communities that they stand in. We must first acknowledge that the power that they hold, and then do the work to create inclusive public spaces and commemoration practices that can evolve in the same way that culture and the ways we think about the past evolves. I also believe that it's incumbent that these decisions are made with the help of the community, or these are decisions that should be made in collaboration with the community. And with that, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you so much, Becci, for that and for sharing some of your work with us and your thoughts on monuments in the state writ large. I've already learned so much from all of the panelists' speeches. I'm making changes to my questions, removing should. Makes sense. But I'll start off with a question to the panelists. That's actually really a series of questions, so you can pick which you'd like to engage with. But starting around the questions of the possibility of reinterpretation and the kind of efficacy of reinterpretation, and also the tension between commemoration and celebration. So some argue that removing forms of public commemoration that depict agents or events of genocide, colonization, and enslavement will contribute to furthering the collective public amnesia in this country about those very histories that we're trying to make more evident. Do you think it's possible to reinterpret or recontextualize these forms of public commemoration in ways that lead to new meanings and new interpretations? Or do they kind of rhetorically speak too loudly to say other things? I'm also wondering what your thoughts are on how communities can publicly commemorate these difficult histories of violence and oppression without celebrating them. And then kind of going to your last point, Becci, who might be involved in these conversations? Who should be invited to be in them? So yes, I welcome your thoughts.
I guess I'll start, take a stab at that first question about how do we reinterpret commemoration or a celebration. As a board member of the Plymouth 400, that's the question that we hit straight on. I'm sitting in the boardroom next to descendants of Brewster and Bradford and some of those first colonizers that came from the Mayflower. And we had some very difficult, tense conversations, emotional, spirited conversations. But by forming a Wampanoag Advisory Committee to be in the room, to have those discussions, the leadership willing to listen and really embrace what is truth, we were able to change the narrative from Plymouth 400 celebration to the commemoration and involve the Wampanoag Advisory Committee in terms of creating new venues to put our narrative, our story forward. One example is the development of an Ancestors Walk to Coles Hill. So here we are right in front of Osamequin statue in Coles Hill, where so much took place, and a walk which will bring the voices and the names of all the villages that were in existence before First Encounter, and calling out the names in traditional ways, led by the Wampanoag Federation, representing all the people of the Wampanoag Nation and tribes, but inviting our neighbors and colleagues to join us. So it is a mournful, commemorative walk, but it's bold and they will make a statement. That's one example. The other is to make sure that our work for Plymouth 400 lives on post the commemoration, and that we lean into those hard and difficult conversations through education, through contributions to the school system, so that we're changing the narrative of what is the true Thanksgiving, what were those real connections like, and what was the impact of them in the negative sense. So that's an example of taking what was coined a celebration and turning it, really stripping it back to some brass tacks.
Thank you.
Sure.
I could give it a go briefly. Try to keep my comments concise. So personally, I tend to honestly think that, I guess I don't really see it for things like this thing we understand as a country currently. So I personally am on the side of, I think everything needs to be undone and redone, particularly thinking about the contemporary calls for the fact that abolition, something that's been a concept in this country for a long time, is at a sort of heightened moment, which I don't think we've seen it in a very long time. The streets are talking, so to speak. So personally, I think there's really larger questions we have to ask about the utility of this thing as a whole. However, when it comes to the question of along the path to some sort of otherwise or different existence, what are some ways that we can think about the past that we encounter on a day-to-day basis? Something that I think about are the words of Christina Sharp, a scholar who wrote a text In the Wake, and she asked this question about how do we memorialize an event that is still ongoing? And I think sort of Steve brought this up earlier, right? With that, being in the room with those folks 400 years later doesn't mean that these sort of ripples and ramifications of that are necessarily gone, right? These things are still happening and we're still impacted by them. So it's kind of maybe part of what I was thinking about earlier with, I think, what often happens in circles around preservation and commemoration work is there's this desire to sort of isolate, right? Like the moment, the event, or the thing. And I would really say that one thing we really have to think about is moving away from that and understanding that whether we take a statue down or keep it up, whether we add a plaque or don't, the thing is still ongoing, right? And that, for me, would be a place where I would suggest we start, is that what do practices of commemoration look like that do not sort of say this person was bad, they're gone, or this person was good and they're here, but that this thing is still ongoing. And that may be that's something I would suggest that I think we think about, is memorialization practices that don't seek to like put something in place, but actually open up so that we can understand that this is all still happening. Right, like Plymouth is still happening right now. Providence is still happening right now. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, and to kind of go off that point and add another question in the mix, and Becci and Stephanie and everyone, please add your thoughts. But, you know, I'm curious what possibilities you see for public commemoration of Rhode Island's history going forward and continuing present, as Chris points out. And, you know, what kinds of public commemoration are constructive, are meaningful, are dynamic, and where should those conversations be taking place?
I would like to acknowledge Steve's statement about the importance of education and how it's so connected to these stories that we tell ourselves about our past, and the lack of honesty that's present in that. I'd also like to draw connections with what Chris said, indeed, about like how we're still in this thing, right? So we can't, by continuing to exist in this cultural landscape with these structures that are created in a way that you have to physically, like the monuments are monumental for a reason, right? The way you relate to them with your physical presence, you have to look up to them. So they send subliminal messages, you know, whether we acknowledge them or recognize those messages as such. They're teaching us just by being in relationship to them. And I think that really thinking about that and thinking about, again, connecting with what Chris said about like, how do we practice or rethink public commemoration in a way that is inclusive of all, but also, you know, considers the present moment and our future posterity is crucial.
Yeah, I think I appreciate the notion that a commemoration, you know, it's a marker of a place and time, but there's this tension that's always involved in these monumental structures, right? Because the people are trying to preserve a history, ensure its legacy, and that's just not possible because we're always, you know, growing, we're learning, we're evolving. And so for me, it seems like the most responsive commemorative actions have to be ephemeral. This idea of permanence is actually, it's a flawed concept that public space is going to be a fixed place. There's going to be a fixed community, that this event or moment that is being captured by this monument is going to withstand the course of human experience and learning. And so, you know, I love Becci's work because I think it gives an opportunity to open up the structures to lots and lots of different stories and histories. That work at Burnside Park, the 6 women highlighted in that, I mean, that's the kind of educational reinterpretation that I think really does begin to unpack the true history of a place and a people.
Thank you so much for all of those thoughts. And as Kristen just announced in the chat, we will open it up for questions from everybody. So we'll try to get to as many as we can. If we, you know, if there are questions that are on the same themes, we'll combine them. But yes, please, all of you, let us know what you'd like to talk about.
I think someone raised their hand in the chat, Julia.
Oh, great. Yes. Yes, I just unmuted you. Rhode Island Slave History Medallions.
Hello, thank you very much for allowing me to come into the chat. I've been listening to everyone's comments, and we're Rhode Island Slave History Medallions. We are placing medallions across the state of Rhode Island that are telling the story of the slave-related history of the state of Rhode Island based on the economic development of the state from the 1600s. So it is an inclusive stories of the Africans and Indians who were enslaved that built this state. When you look at a monument, like I mean, you're looking at a moment in time that has been frozen. And that moment in time belongs to all of us, so that we get a chance to tell and interpret that moment within ourselves from that exact place that you stand. It's like holy ground. And by having a monument or that represents the inclusiveness of the people that were enslaved, not taking down Columbus or some of the other statues, because they are a part of history too. They're a moment in time. But we need to put up statues that represent, and just to say, or us. I mean, when I was a child in Newport, I walked around and saw all these gorgeous nymphs and people with arrows and all this, and all these generals. I never saw anything that represented me. So I never even really thought I belonged there. I wasn't a part of the landscape. I wasn't part of the moment. I just was a thing that was here. So I had to find my own way. Fortunately, I played in the God's Little Acre, and I saw all those angel images. And later on, I realized, or was learned rather, education is an important part, that that image was created by Pompey Stevens. And he not only created it, but he signed it. It was an act of defiance for his slave master. And by signing it, he's let all of us know that all these angel images that you see across the state of Rhode Island and elsewhere were created by slaves. That's extended the moment so that we can relate to it by knowing this about him. We learn a new knowingness about ourselves, and we can relate to it and then take it to another level. So I'm not exactly for tearing down monuments. I'm for building up, because this is a new time and we need to celebrate it by putting something there that says so. And that's my take on it.
Thank you. Would anybody, any of the panelists like to respond?
I could. I didn't want to talk too much. Thank you. What was your name again, brother? Thank you first off for the work that you're doing in community. And I guess what I would say is sort of thinking along with you is part of even looking at you all's own practice, right? It's sort of this way that, at least as you were sharing with us, about really going into spaces and creating sort of maps, really, or like pathways for us to sort of learn this history differently. I will say though, for me, I kind of do see the appeal of some of the tearing down, and I'll say just for me, because I think what's hard for me sometimes is how can these things coexist, you know, right? So how does someone like, say, a Columbus or whoever sort of coexist, right, alongside the things that we're talking about? Because for me, I want also, I'm thinking about how do we also understand that what we see as a monument of Columbus, like that's not even, I guess this is maybe some of Becky's point, I don't know that that's even a history of Columbus as much as sort of like a caricaturized representation that we're then supposed to embrace of him. So I'm with you on, right, like the history is history, and right, like we can't sort of say this happened and that didn't. I think, at least for me, it's part of how I think about monuments, though, particularly those that we usually see. They tend to be not really narratives of what's happened at all, but really these very particular propagandized type representations that are made to, like you said, made to make us think that we're just things. We're not even here in the story. But more importantly, whether what I think about it, I just want to thank you for the work that y'all are doing, because I really want to find more about where these medallions are and see if I can, you know, learn something from the work that y'all are doing as well. So I think we can do both, but again, beyond that, I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. I appreciate it.
No, I'll second that.
Same, if I can jump in as well. Oh, right.
Me too.
Just a quick echo to that point. I'm sorry, Becky. It's everywhere we walk in Rhode Island, everywhere we step, it's on another person's footprint who came before us. There is a story at every corner. It's not just the fact that we know of Burrs Hill or Mount Hope. There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of blocks and rivers and meadows and city blocks that have history that is tied in blood and sweat and joy and a tradition and ritual and something that is sacred. So again, I also commend any work that is helping to recognize that and give it honor and respect. I do also tend to differ that if we're talking about brotherhood and equality, we can't drink from that cup if it's filled with the bile of bigotry without calling it out for what it is. You know, let's fill that with honesty and truth and love. And we have to call out if there's a distortion of a time period that was exalting a false narrative. We can't, in my opinion, humble, leave it standing there to continue to echo the false narrative without calling it out or bringing attention to it. And I think back to look at Germany and how they've dealt with the issue of Nazism and the Holocaust. And even though it was a time period, there are places where you can go to see where those relics or sculptures or signs of that time period in a place that's context with truth and perspective and impact of what that meant. And so I think we have a responsibility to attach that as well to the current state.
Thank you so much. In the interest of trying to stay on time and also make sure everyone's questions are addressed, I encourage you to submit the questions in the chat so we can make sure that we are just touching on as many things as possible. So one question that came in from Kate Wells from the Providence Public Library is thinking about Stephanie's points about how and by whom commemorative works were established and the fact that they were usually privately funded. That they exist at all is based on a system of cultural, economic, or political power. How important is clarification of the original intention versus how the work may be understood in our current interpretation?
Well, I think for me, I do find it really interesting to understand the intent of how these objects made their way to the public realm. And it's more for context. I really do appreciate this addressing the false narratives by removing these objects. I hear the need to do that and to address that with seriousness. But I do think it's also important to know that these are objects that were put in place by, I don't know, other people. I think sometimes they seem so fixed and so immovable that we don't engage with them as having their own histories in place. And so for me, I just think it's an important piece of the story of our place and to understand how they made their way there.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to address that, or we have more questions? Okay, we will go to a question from Kim Hewson, who says, Becky, I know that your 6 women piece in Birdside Park was temporary. It was a monument, but it was not part of the installation's expression. But part of the installation's expression included its impermanence in comparison to the equestrian statue with Birdside. So was it documented? Education is key, but the stories were so apparently impermanent. How can we continue to use those undertold stories to educate?
Thank you for that question. So with this project, even though the sort of the site-specific interventions were temporary, the project is ongoing. I've continued to work on painting pieces that sort of function as monuments, but they include the research that went into doing that project. So those sort of, they have their own life. There's also a website that was created with information that catalogs the research that I have done and continue to do on all 6 women, visiting their homesteads, photographing those that still have homes that exist in the state, going to those homes and photographing them. Housing documents that I've collected having to do with them, handwritten letters that exist in archives, and sharing that information so that as many people as possible can have access to it, even when not in the space of the park.
Thank you. And a question from Rose LaMountain. Why not correct the false narrative on the monuments and place them next to the truth?
I could maybe take a go at that one. So again, I guess the question becomes then, what do we mean by all of these things, right? What do we mean by correctness? What do we mean by truth? And there is, and perhaps this somewhat picks up on Steve's point, is that, so I guess for me, I think about this in the context of sort of what pushed the calls for monument removal a few years back. I've spent a lot of time, again, I'm from Baltimore, where 4 Confederate monuments were taken down. I've spent a lot of time in New Orleans, Richmond, Charleston, all places that have had sort of significant movement over the past 5 years, right? And in the sort of city commissions and the sort of public conversations, this topic comes up, right? In fact, in Baltimore, prior to the monuments being taken down, there were sort of contextual plaques added, sort of about 6 feet or so away from the monument itself. This sort of gave insight to what was occurring. I guess in response to that question, I would say that there's something to be said about the act of removal and taking down that I think is significant, in that we really have seen that maybe over the past couple of months, that it's not, and this is also, honestly, I will say this on this platform, I'm someone who does think that what we call, quote, vandalism or destruction should be decriminalized. That's just me sort of making a statement. But I think this is important because states, governments, city officials often take credit for things that have been pushed by people who went about it in a way that they did not approve of, right? In New Orleans, Mayor Landrieu has in fact written a book about how much New Orleans has improved and gotten better, he being the same person who was going so hard at people on the streets for years for doing the very thing which he has now sort of attenuated to his reputation as a politician. So for me, I think that the value in removal is it is an opportunity for the people, irrespective of what we think, others think, politicians think, regardless of what whoever thinks, they are saying it needs to go on their time and no one else's. So I think for me, I think about removal less as a sort of intellectual question and more about that it is an opportunity for the people to say that we have had enough. This needs to go now. And yes, I think that exists alongside these other new things need to happen, but at least from my own vantage point, I think there's something to be said for actions that are not ushered in government offices, but are ushered in by people simply being fed up. And I think that removal is a strong case for that.
And if I can just jump in off with Chris's point, what are we holding on to? What is really being defended? And I'm just throwing a question out there and really putting it out there to the beloved community, all of us. When there are icons or statues or commemorations that now that we know the curtain's been pulled back and the information is now front and center, black and white, then what are we holding on to look the other way or to cover our eyes or our ears? What are we boiling down to in its essence that makes it a debate? Or I understand tradition, but if that tradition again doesn't fall in line with what we claim to hold dear, which is liberty and justice and equity, love for our fellow human being, then maybe those are the type of questions we need to ask ourselves as we debate this and we get into this. That's all. I think that's a question we should all ponder.
Yes. Well, thank you for that and for all of these thoughtful comments and questions. I know we've had some more come in, and I apologize that we are at time. Clearly, this is a much bigger conversation than can be taken on in an hour and a half. But I so appreciate your embarking on this with us. And, I apologize if we didn't get to your question. Feel free to email it, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. And so with that, I want to thank our panelists and also hand it over to Deborah Sharp, who is our executive director.
I was so far into the conversation, I almost forgot to unmute myself. So, like Julia, I'm really sorry we can't get to more questions. This has been such an interesting conversation, and I'm excited. I think we all are to see the interest in this, and as we move forward with doing more programming around these issues, I really want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This was incredibly interesting and informative. And of course, we'd like to acknowledge and thank our wonderful panelists, Councilman Stephen Craddock, Dr. Christopher Roberts, Stephanie Fortunato, and Becci Davis. You were all just wonderful, so interesting and so informative and so thoughtful. And of course, our very own Julia Renaud, who is our exhibition manager and curator at the Center for Reconciliation, for moderating today's presentation. We're grateful for all of you sharing your expertise and insights. Thank you very much. And for everyone else, thank you for joining us. As you know, the Center for Reconciliation is a nonprofit organization. The mission of the CFR is racial reconciliation and racial justice by fostering racial reconciliation and racial injustice by confronting the legacy of slavery. And we do that with programs like this. I love the conversation about educational reinterpretation and a new knowing. And so that's what we are striving to do is teaching our history and confronting the legacy and the ongoing ramifications of slavery in our state. And as such, we rely on your generous support to help present these programs and to continue our mission. So thank you to all of you who have already donated to help underwrite the cost of some of these things. And we ask that you consider making a contribution to the work of the CFR as you are able to. Please visit our website so you can stay in touch with us. Stay tuned for ongoing programs and conversations. The website is cfrri.org, so please visit us. And thank you for being with us. That we really appreciate you being here, your interest in this topic, and your ongoing interest in the work of the Center for Reconciliation. So thank you and be well.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Providence.